Captain Kale stood on the bridge of his ship and looked at the star charts with tired eyes. The Nexus Prime had been traveling through empty space for 3 months now, and all they had found were dead rocks and gas clouds. His crew was getting restless, and he could not blame them for feeling that way. The Vorthak Empire had sent them to explore this sector because their long-range sensors had detected something interesting, but so far, they had found nothing worth reporting back home. The star system ahead was marked as Sol on their ancient charts, but nobody really knew much about it. Their computers said it had 9 planets and 1 yellow star, but that was all the information they had. Most star systems like this one were either empty or filled with primitive life forms that had never learned to build cities or fly between the stars. Kyle expected this system to be just like all the others they had visited. Commander Yuna walked up to him and handed him a data pad with the latest sensor readings. She was the best scientist they had on the ship, and if anyone could find something interesting in this boring sector of space, it would be her. Her green skin looked pale under the bridge lights, and her 4 eyes showed the same tiredness that Kale felt in his bones. The third planet from the star was showing some unusual readings. According to the sensors, it was the right size to support life, and it was in the zone where water could exist as a liquid instead of ice or steam. What made it strange was that their long-range scanners were picking up traces of metal and other materials that should not exist on a planet that had never been visited by space travelers. Kale ordered his crew to set course for the third planet, and they would take a closer look. The journey took them 6 hours, and as they got closer, the sensor readings became even more confusing. The planet was covered in what looked like the ruins of massive cities. These were not small settlements, but huge structures that stretched across entire continents. Some of the buildings were so tall that they reached up into the atmosphere and beyond. The most shocking thing was the orbital elevators. These were massive structures that connected the surface of the planet to stations in space. They were broken now, and pieces of them floated in orbit around the planet like the bones of some giant creature. Whoever had built these things must have had technology that was far beyond anything the Vorthak Empire had ever seen. Yuna ran more detailed scans and found that the ruins were incredibly old. The computer estimated that they had been abandoned for at least 500,000 years. That was an almost impossible amount of time, and it made Kale wonder what kind of disaster could have forced an entire civilization to abandon their home world. The buildings were covered in plant life, and erosion had worn down many of the structures, but they were still clearly visible from orbit. As they orbited the planet, Kyle noticed something else that made his spine tingle with fear. There were energy signatures coming from various locations on the surface. They were very faint, but they were definitely there. Something on this supposedly dead world was still drawing power after 500,000 years. That should have been impossible with any technology that Kyle knew about. He ordered a landing party to investigate one of the stronger energy signatures. Commander Yuna would lead the team along with 6 armed soldiers and their best engineers. They would take shuttles down to the surface and see what was creating these mysterious energy readings. Kale wanted answers, and he wanted them quickly because something about this planet made him very nervous. The landing site was what appeared to be a massive spaceport built into the side of a mountain. The structures were covered in strange symbols that none of their computers could translate. The architecture was unlike anything in their databases, and it seemed to be made from materials that their scanners could not properly identify. Everything was built on a scale that dwarfed even the largest Vorthak constructions. Yuna and her team explored the ruins for several hours and found more questions than answers. The technology they discovered was clearly more advanced than their own, but it was all cold and dead. Whoever had lived here had left in a hurry, and they had taken most of their important equipment with them. What remained were just the bones of a civilization that had once spanned the stars. But then they found the first ship. It was buried deep beneath what their geological surveys said had once been an ocean. Their sensors had detected a massive, metallic object that was easily the size of a small moon. When they used their excavation equipment to dig down to it, they found something that took their breath away. It was a ship, but unlike any vessel they had ever seen before. The hull was made from some kind of metal that seemed to shift and flow even though it was completely solid. It was covered in the same strange symbols they had found in the ruins, but these ones seemed to glow with a faint inner light. The ship was shaped like some kind of predatory animal with sleek lines and curves that made it look like it was moving, even when it was standing still. Admiral Minho arrived with a full fleet within days of receiving Kale's report. He brought with him the best scientists and engineers the Vorthak Empire had to offer. They set up a base camp around the buried ship and began the slow process of trying to understand what they had found. More ships were discovered as they expanded their search. Dozens of them were buried beneath the ocean floor, and each one was a masterpiece of engineering. The strangest thing about all the ships was that they were still powered. After 500,000 years buried in mud and sediment, they were still drawing energy from some unknown source. Their computers were still active and their hull plating was still intact. It was as if they had been placed in some kind of suspended animation and were just waiting for someone to wake them up. Dr. Hyun was the first to notice that the ships were repairing themselves. Tiny scratches and dents that appeared during the excavation process would disappear within hours. The hull material seemed to be alive in some way, and it was constantly working to maintain the integrity of the vessel. He had never seen anything like it in all his years of studying alien technology. The symbol that appeared most often on all the ships was a blue and green sphere with white swirls covering its surface. It took them several days to realize that this symbol was a picture of the planet they were standing on. The same world that was now covered in ruins and dead cities had once been home to whoever built these incredible ships. But that raised even more questions about what had happened to force them to abandon their home. As more ships were uncovered, it became clear that this was not just a small fleet, but an entire armada. There were hundreds of vessels buried beneath the ocean, and each one was different from the others. Some were massive battleships that could have taken on an entire Vorthak fleet, while others were smaller and faster vessels designed for reconnaissance and quick strikes. All of them shared the same advanced technology, and all of them were still waiting in the darkness beneath the waves. Captain Kyle stood on the observation deck of his ship and looked down at the planet below. What had started as a routine exploration mission had turned into the discovery of a lifetime. They had found the remains of a civilization that had technology far beyond their own, and for some reason, they had chosen to abandon everything and disappear into the stars. The question that haunted him was whether they were really gone, or if they were just waiting somewhere out there in the darkness for the right moment to return home. 3 months had passed since the first ship was discovered, and the excavation site had grown into a massive operation. Admiral Minho had brought in mining equipment from across the Empire, and hundreds of scientists were working around the clock to uncover more vessels. The ocean floor had been transformed into a grid of dig sites, and each new discovery brought more questions than answers. Dr. Hyun had been studying the hull material of the ships, and his findings were disturbing. The metal was not just repairing itself, but it was actually learning from the damage it received. When they cut into it with plasma torches, the material would develop a resistance to that specific type of energy. When they tried to drill through it, the surface would become harder exactly where they were trying to penetrate. It was as if the ships were alive and actively defending themselves from intrusion. The power cores were even more mysterious. They used principles of physics that the Vorthak had never encountered before. The energy output was stable and constant, but they could not figure out what was feeding the reactors. There were no fuel tanks or external power sources that they could identify. The ship seemed to be drawing energy from empty space itself and converting it into usable power. This technology could revolutionize their entire civilization if they could understand how it worked. Commander Yuna had been focusing her efforts on the computer systems, and she was making slow progress in deciphering the alien language. The symbols were incredibly complex and seemed to have multiple layers of meaning, depending on how they were arranged. She had managed to identify a few basic concepts like navigation and power management, but the deeper functions remained locked behind encryption that her best code breakers could not crack. Captain Su was leading the exploration team that was mapping the interior of the largest ship they had found. The vessel was over 10 kilometers long and had dozens of levels that seemed to serve different functions. There were what appeared to be weapon systems that used technology they could not comprehend. There were living quarters designed for creatures that walked on 2 legs and had similar body proportions to the Vorthak. Most importantly, there was a command center that was still partially active. The bridge of the ship was a marvel of engineering that made their own command centers look primitive. Holographic displays showed star charts and tactical information that was still being updated in real time. The computers were tracking the movement of objects throughout the galaxy and maintaining detailed records of stellar phenomena that would take Vorthak scientists centuries to compile. Whoever had built this ship had access to a network of sensors and monitoring stations that spanned the known universe, but it was what they found in the captain's ready room that changed everything. Behind a door that had taken them weeks to open, they discovered a figure sitting in what appeared to be a command chair. The being was wearing some kind of environmental suit that had kept it perfectly preserved for the 500,000 years since the ship was buried. Medical scanners showed that it was still alive but in some kind of suspended animation. When Captain Sue's team tried to interface with the ship's computer systems, a holographic projector activated and filled the room with blue light. The image that appeared was of a female being that looked similar to the figure in the chair, but without the environmental suit. She had smooth skin and long dark hair, and her eyes showed an intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar. When she began to speak, the universal translator struggled to process her language but eventually managed to provide a rough translation. The message she left behind was both fascinating and terrifying. Her name was Admiral Ji-young, and she had been the commander of this vessel before it was placed in what she called the Great Sleep. She spoke of an enemy that was coming from beyond the edge of the galaxy, a force that consumed entire civilizations and left nothing but empty worlds in their wake. She called them the Devourers, and her voice carried a hatred that had been building for centuries. According to her message, the civilization that had built these ships had not died out or been destroyed. They had made the strategic decision to evacuate their homeworld and spread themselves across the galaxy. They had spent decades preparing for this moment, and when the time came, they had implemented a plan that spanned multiple star systems. The ships buried on this world were just the beginning of a much larger network of vessels that were waiting in hidden locations throughout known space. The most shocking part of her message was the revelation that they had chosen to use their own world as bait. The Devourers were attracted to planets that showed signs of advanced civilization. By abandoning their cities and allowing them to fall into ruin, they had made it appear that their species had gone extinct. When the Devourers eventually arrived, they would expect to find an empty world that they could strip of resources without any resistance. Instead, they would find a trap that had been 500,000 years in the making. The sleeping war fleets would awaken, and humanity would finally have their revenge against the force that had driven them from their home. Admiral Ji-young's message ended with a warning that made Captain Sue's blood run cold. The excavation of the ships and the activation of their computer systems had sent a signal across the galaxy. Other fleets would be receiving the wake-up call and beginning their own preparations for the final battle. Commander Yuna realized the horrible implications of what they had discovered. By uncovering the ships and interfacing with their computers, the Vorthak had accidentally triggered something that had been waiting for 500,000 years. They had announced to the universe that Earth was no longer sleeping and that humanity was preparing to return. Somewhere in the depths of space, ancient enemies would detect these signals and begin moving toward the Sol system for a confrontation that would determine the fate of multiple civilizations. The discovery also explained some of the strange energy readings they had been detecting throughout the galaxy over the past few months. Long-range sensors had picked up unusual power signatures from star systems that were supposed to be uninhabited. What they had assumed were natural phenomena were actually other human fleets beginning to wake up from their extended hibernation. The network that Admiral Ji-young had mentioned was vast, and it was spread across hundreds of worlds. Dr. Hyun made another disturbing discovery when he analyzed the ship's weapon systems. The technology was not just advanced, but it was terrifying in its implications. The weapons appeared to be capable of destroying entire planets, and the targeting computers could track objects across interstellar distances. These were not just warships, but instruments of total annihilation, designed by a species that had spent centuries planning their revenge against an implacable enemy. Admiral Minho called an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss their options. They could try to contact the Vorthak homeworld and request instructions, but it would take months for a message to reach them, and even longer for a response to come back. They could attempt to leave the system before whatever was coming arrived, but their ships were not fast enough to outrun vessels that used the advanced technology they had discovered buried beneath the ocean. The third option was the most dangerous, but also the most intriguing. They could try to wake up the figure in the command chair and attempt to communicate directly with a representative of this ancient human civilization. The medical scanners indicated that the being was still alive, and the life support systems in the environmental suit were still functioning. If they could safely revive the sleeper, they might be able to learn more about what was coming and perhaps even negotiate some kind of arrangement. Captain Sue volunteered to oversee the revival process since she had spent the most time studying the ship's systems. The medical team would need to proceed very carefully since they were dealing with biology and technology that they did not fully understand. One mistake could kill the sleeper or trigger defensive systems that might consider their actions to be an attack on the vessel. As they prepared for the most important first contact in Vorthak history, strange things began happening throughout the galaxy. Ships that had been dormant for 500,000 years were powering up on dozens of different worlds. Ancient communication networks were activating and sending coded messages between star systems. The Great Sleep was ending, and humanity was beginning to wake up from their long hibernation. The being in the command chair stirred slightly as the medical team began the revival process. After 500,000 years of waiting, the captain of the Eternal Vigil was about to open her eyes and see what had become of the universe she had left behind. The Vorthak were about to meet a species that had turned patience into the ultimate weapon, and their encounter would change the course of galactic history forever. Admiral Minho watched the long-range sensor displays with growing alarm as massive energy signatures appeared throughout the galaxy. The awakening was not limited to the Sol system, but was happening simultaneously across hundreds of star systems. Ancient ships that had been dormant for 500,000 years were powering up and beginning to move. The network that Admiral Ji-young had mentioned in her message was revealing itself to be far larger than anyone had imagined. The revival process had taken 18 hours, but Captain Hanul had finally awakened from her long sleep. When she opened her eyes and looked around the command bridge, her first words were spoken in the ancient human language that the universal translators were still struggling to decode. She asked how long she had been asleep, and when Commander Yuna told her that 500,000 years had passed, she simply nodded as if she had expected that answer. Captain Hanul moved through the ship with the confidence of someone who knew every system and every corridor. Her muscles were weak from the extended hibernation, but her mind was sharp and focused. She began issuing orders to computers that responded instantly to her voice commands. Systems that the Vorthak scientists had been unable to access for months opened up at her touch. The ship was coming alive around her like a sleeping giant, awakening from a long dream. The Eternal Vigil began to rise from its ocean grave with a grace that defied the laws of physics as the Vorthak understood them. 500,000 years of sediment and debris fell away from the hull like water as the vessel lifted itself toward the surface. The ocean boiled and steamed around the massive ship, but the hull remained undamaged by the violent forces at work. The technology that had kept it safe beneath the waves was more advanced than anything in the Vorthak databases. As the Eternal Vigil broke through the surface of the ocean, other ships began to rise as well. Dozens of vessels that had been buried beneath continents and hidden in deep trenches started their own ascent toward the surface. Each ship was unique in design, but they all shared the same sleek, predatory appearance that marked them as weapons of war. The fleet that was emerging from the depths of Earth was unlike anything that had ever been seen in the known galaxy. Lieutenant Doyun was the second human to awaken, and he served as Captain Hanul's second-in-command. He explained to the frightened Vorthak delegation that the Great Sleep had never been about hiding from the Devourers, but about giving them time to become overconfident. Humanity had spread throughout the galaxy and established hidden bases on worlds that appeared to be uninhabited. They had spent centuries preparing for the day when their ancient enemy would return, and they would finally have their revenge. The ships that were rising from Earth's oceans were just the beginning of humanity's preparations. Similar fleets were awakening on 100 different worlds, and they were all equipped with technology that had been refined and perfected during the long years of waiting. The humans had not spent their time in hibernation, but had remained partially aware and had continued to upgrade and improve their weapon systems through automated manufacturing facilities. Captain Hunnell demonstrated the power of human technology when Admiral Minho requested a show of the ship's capabilities. She selected a large asteroid that was orbiting the planet and targeted it with what she called a matter conversion beam. The asteroid did not explode or break apart, but simply ceased to exist. The matter that had composed the rock was converted directly into energy so efficiently that there was not even debris left behind to mark where it had been. The weapon that had destroyed the asteroid was just one of dozens that were mounted on the Eternal Vigil. Each system was designed to counter specific types of enemy ships and tactics that humanity had encountered during their long war with the Devourers. The humans had studied their enemy for millennia and had developed weapons that could exploit every weakness in Devourer technology and biology. Dr. Hyun was given permission to study some of the human systems, and what he discovered changed his understanding of what was possible with advanced engineering. The ships were not just built, but grown using nanotechnology that could manipulate matter at the atomic level. The hull material was a living metal that could repair itself and adapt to new threats. The computers were not just processors, but artificial intelligences that had been learning and evolving for 500,000 years. The most shocking discovery was that the human ships could reproduce themselves given sufficient raw materials and time. They carried manufacturing systems that could build new vessels using resources gathered from asteroids and dead planets. During the long years of waiting, they had been slowly building additional ships and expanding their fleets. What had started as an evacuation force had become an armada that spanned the galaxy. Commander Yuna established communication with other awakening fleets and learned that humanity had been busy during their supposed extinction. They had not just hidden their ships, but had also been secretly observing and studying every spacefaring civilization in the galaxy. They knew about the Forthak Empire and dozens of other species that had risen to prominence during the past 500,000 years. Humanity had been watching and learning while remaining invisible to their observers. The humans had also been preparing defenses against the Devourers that went beyond simple military vessels. They had constructed massive orbital fortresses around strategic star systems and had seeded space with automated weapons platforms that would activate when the enemy approached. The galaxy was filled with hidden traps and ambush points that had been positioned during centuries of careful planning. Captain Su was invited aboard a human vessel called the Righteous Fury and was amazed by what she saw. The ship was alive in ways that defied understanding. The corridors seemed to shift and change depending on what was needed, and the walls could become transparent to provide views of space or solid to protect against enemy fire. The crew quarters were designed to accommodate beings that could adapt to different environmental conditions, and the life support systems could maintain dozens of different atmospheric compositions. Colonel Taewon was the commander of the Righteous Fury, and he explained that human technology had evolved far beyond what it had been when they first left Earth. The long sleep had allowed their automated systems to continue research and development without the limitations of biological consciousness. They had solved problems that had puzzled their scientists for generations, and had developed capabilities that seemed magical to species that still relied on traditional physics and engineering. The human ships moved through space using drives that manipulated gravity and space-time rather than simple chemical or nuclear propulsion. They could accelerate to incredible speeds without experiencing the effects of inertia, and they could change direction instantly without the gradual turns that limited conventional vessels. Their sensors could detect objects across interstellar distances, and their communication systems used quantum entanglement to provide instantaneous contact between ships, regardless of how far apart they were. As more ships rose from Earth's hiding places, it became clear that the planet had been transformed into a massive military base during the years before the evacuation. Every ocean and continent had been used to conceal vessels and weapon systems. The orbital elevators that the Vorthak had seen were not just transportation systems but launch platforms for spacecraft that had been built in orbital shipyards. Earth had become the ultimate fortress world, designed to lure the Devourers into a trap they could not escape. The awakening. Fleets began to take their positions throughout the Sol system, in preparation for what Captain Hanul called the final battle. Ships that had been sleeping for 500,000 years moved with coordination that spoke of planning and preparation that spanned geological time periods. Every vessel knew its role in the coming conflict, and every crew member had trained for this moment before entering their long hibernation. Admiral Minho realized that his fleet was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. An entire civilization had faked its own extinction and had spent 500,000 years preparing for a single battle that would determine the fate of every thinking being in the universe. The patience and dedication required for such an undertaking was beyond anything the Vorthak could have imagined. The humans offered the Vorthak fleet protection during the coming battle, but made it clear that they expected the conflict to be brief and decisive. Captain Hanul explained that humanity had learned from their previous encounters with the Devourers, and this time they were prepared for every possible tactic their enemy might employ. The war that had driven humanity from their homeworld was about to end, and the species that had waited so long for revenge was finally ready to claim it. As the last ships rose from their hiding places beneath Earth's surface, the planet began to transform once again. Automated systems that had been dormant for millennia came online and began rebuilding the cities and infrastructure that had been abandoned so long ago. Earth was preparing to welcome its children home after their long exile among the stars. The sleeping war fleet had awakened and humanity was ready to reclaim their place in the galaxy. The Devourers arrived exactly as Admiral Ji-young had predicted they would. Their massive fleet emerged from the darkness between stars like a plague of locusts descending upon a field of grain. The ships were organic-looking vessels that seemed to have been grown rather than built, and they moved through space with the fluid grace of living creatures. Each one was the size of a city, and their hulls pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of intelligence beyond normal comprehension. Captain Hanul stood on the bridge of the Eternal Vigil and watched the enemy fleet approach through sensors that could track objects across light years of space. She had been waiting for this moment for 500,000 years, and now that it had finally arrived, she felt only calm determination. The hatred that had sustained her species through their long exile was focused into a cold rage that would not be satisfied until every Devourer ship had been reduced to cosmic dust. The Devourers had expected to find a dead world ripe for harvesting, but instead they encountered something that challenged everything they understood about the universe. Earth was surrounded by a shell of human warships that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than most civilizations had existed. The planet itself had been transformed into a fortress that bristled with weapons designed to destroy things that should not be able to die. Admiral Ji-young appeared as a hologram on the command bridge of every human vessel simultaneously. She was no longer the recorded message they had found in the buried ship, but a living consciousness that had been sustained by technology that defied the laws of physics, as most species understood them. Her first words to the Devourer fleet were broadcast on every frequency and in every language that existed in their databases. The message was simple and delivered with 500,000 years of accumulated fury. Humanity had not forgotten what the Devourers had done to them. They had not forgiven the destruction of their colonies and the murder of billions of innocent people. They had spent 500,000 years preparing for this moment, and they would not be driven away again. The Devourers were welcome to try to take Earth, but they would find that humanity had learned new ways to kill things that had previously been immortal. The first wave of Devourer ships moved toward Earth with the confidence of predators that had never encountered effective resistance. They had consumed 1,000 civilizations and had grown accustomed to the terror and desperation of their victims. What they found instead were human vessels that moved like nothing they had ever encountered. The ships accelerated from rest to incredible speeds instantly, and changed direction without the gradual curves that physics should have required. Colonel Taewon commanded the first human strike force, and his ships attacked the Devourer vanguard, with weapons that had been designed specifically to counter their enemies' advantages. The Devourers had always relied on their ability to regenerate damage and adapt to new threats, but the human weapons did not simply destroy tissue or disable systems. They unraveled the quantum structures that held matter together and reduced their targets to component atoms that could not be rebuilt or repaired. The battle was unlike anything the universe had witnessed before. The Devourers had spent millions of years perfecting their ability to consume and convert matter into more of themselves. They could repair battle damage almost instantly, and their ships could grow new weapons and defenses in response to enemy attacks. But humanity had spent 500,000 years studying their enemy, and had developed countermeasures for every ability the Devourers possessed. Captain Soyoung led a reconnaissance squadron that moved through the battle zone gathering intelligence on Devourer tactics and capabilities. What she discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The enemy was exactly as powerful as human records indicated, but they were also predictable. They had not evolved or adapted during the long years since their last encounter with humanity. Their overconfidence had made them complacent and vulnerable to tactics they had never faced before. The human ships fought with a coordination that spoke of planning that spanned geological time periods. Every vessel knew exactly where it needed to be and when it needed to be there. Their movements were choreographed with mathematical precision, and their attacks were timed to exploit momentary weaknesses in enemy formations. The Devourers found themselves facing an enemy that anticipated their every move and had prepared counters for tactics they had not yet decided to employ. Dr. Hyun watched the battle from the safety of the Vorthak fleet and tried to comprehend what he was seeing. The human weapons did not simply destroy enemy ships but seemed to edit them out of existence. Matter that had been part of Devourer vessels simply ceased to be without the violent explosions or debris fields that should have resulted from such massive destructions. It was as if reality itself was being rewritten to exclude anything that humanity considered to be an enemy. The most shocking moment came when the Devourers attempted to use their ultimate weapon against the human fleet. They had a ship that was the size of a small moon, and it was designed to consume entire planets by converting their matter into energy and using that power to fuel more Devourer vessels. When they fired this weapon at Earth, the beam simply disappeared as it approached the atmosphere. The planet was protected by defenses that could neutralize attacks that should have been unstoppable. Admiral Minho realized that he was witnessing the most one-sided battle in galactic history. The Devourers had terrorized the universe for millions of years and had destroyed civilizations that had seemed invincible. But they had never faced a species that had turned genocide into a 500,000-year military exercise. Humanity had not just survived their exile, but had used it to become something far more dangerous than they had ever been before. The human ships revealed capabilities that seemed to violate every law of physics that the Vorthak understood. Some vessels could exist in multiple locations simultaneously and attack enemy formations from directions that should have been impossible. Others could manipulate time itself and strike at Devourer ships before those vessels had decided to enter the battle zone. The technology that humanity had developed during their long sleep was indistinguishable from magic to species that still relied on conventional science. Captain Hanul demonstrated the true power of human hatred when she personally destroyed the Devourer command ship. The Eternal Vigil moved through space like a living thing, and its weapons carved through enemy defenses as if they were made of paper. The massive Devourer vessel tried to regenerate the damage but found that human weapons prevented any form of healing or repair. Within minutes, the ship that had commanded a fleet of thousands was nothing more than expanding gas and scattered particles. The battle reached its climax when Admiral Ji-young revealed humanity's ultimate surprise. The ships that had risen from Earth's oceans were not their entire fleet, but just the bait needed to draw the Devourers into the trap. The real human armada had been waiting in the spaces between dimensions, and it emerged into normal space around the enemy fleet like a closing fist. Thousands of human vessels appeared simultaneously, and the Devourers found themselves surrounded by an enemy that had been preparing for this moment since before their own civilization had learned to build cities. Lieutenant Doyun coordinated the final assault, and his tactical displays showed the complete destruction of Devourer capabilities throughout the galaxy. Human fleets that had been hidden on hundreds of worlds were attacking simultaneously, and the ancient enemy was being systematically eliminated from existence. The species that had terrorized the universe for millions of years was learning what it felt like to face extinction at the hands of beings that understood the true meaning of patience and preparation. The Vorthak delegation watched in stunned silence as the most powerful force in galactic history, was methodically destroyed by an enemy they had believed to be extinct. The humans fought with a precision and efficiency that spoke of planning that had begun before their own species had learned to use fire. Every shot was calculated to achieve maximum damage, and every tactical decision was based on intelligence that had been gathered during centuries of careful observation. As the last Devourer ships were reduced to their component atoms, Captain Hanul stood on her bridge and looked out at the space where an enemy fleet had been only hours before. The war that had driven humanity from their home was finally over. The species that had spent 500,000 years planning their revenge had achieved something that no other civilization had ever accomplished. They had completely eliminated a force that had seemed invincible, and they had done it with a patience that had transformed them into something far beyond what they had been when they first fled Earth. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity had not just survived their exile but had used it to evolve into the ultimate guardians of civilized space. The sleeping war fleet had awakened, and the universe would never be the same. The war lasted exactly 14 hours and 23 minutes from the moment the first Devourer ship entered the Sol system until the last enemy vessel was converted to harmless particles scattered across interstellar space. Admiral Ji-young stood on the bridge of her flagship Terra's Vengeance and surveyed the empty void where the most feared fleet in galactic history had been reduced to nothing more than fading energy signatures and cooling gas clouds. The silence that followed the battle was profound in ways that went beyond the mere absence of weapons fire and exploding ships. For the first time in millions of years, the galaxy was free from the threat that had haunted the dreams of every spacefaring civilization. The Devourers had not simply been defeated or driven away, but had been systematically erased from existence by weapons that unmade matter at levels so fundamental that even their ability to regenerate could not save them. Captain Hanul walked through the corridors of the Eternal Vigil and felt the weight of 500,000 years lifting from her shoulders. Her crew members were emerging from their battle stations with expressions of wonder and relief that spoke of emotions too complex for any language to describe. They had accomplished something that their ancestors had believed to be impossible, and they had done it with a completeness that ensured the ancient enemy would never threaten another world. The human fleet that had converged on Earth from hundreds of different star systems began to disperse as quickly as it had assembled. Ships that had traveled for months to reach the Sol system were already plotting courses back to their hidden bases and monitoring stations throughout the galaxy. The network that had sustained humanity during their long exile was now free to pursue goals that went beyond simple survival and preparation for war. Admiral Minho approached the human command ship with a delegation of Vorthak officers who were still trying to process what they had witnessed. The battle had been so one-sided that it barely qualified as a conflict rather than an execution. The most powerful military force in known history had been eliminated by an enemy they had believed to be extinct, and the implications of this reversal were staggering to contemplate. The Vorthak delegation expected to be met with demands for surrender or threats of conquest, but instead found themselves facing something they had not anticipated. Captain Hanul greeted them with the same courtesy she might have shown to visiting dignitaries rather than representatives of a species that had accidentally triggered their return to active status. Her first words were not about domination or tribute, but about protection and cooperation. Commander Yuna learned that humanity's long sleep had taught them lessons that went far beyond military tactics and weapon design. The species that had once fought wars among themselves over territorial disputes and resource conflicts had evolved into something that measured success in terms of civilizations protected rather than enemies destroyed. Their exile had given them a perspective that encompassed geological timescales, and they had learned to think in terms of the welfare of entire galactic ecosystems. Lieutenant Doyen explained humanity's new mission to the assembled representatives of 17 different species that had been contacted by human vessels throughout the galaxy. They would serve as guardians rather than conquerors, and would use their advanced technology to ensure that no civilization would ever again face extinction from cosmic predators or interstellar disasters. The Great Sleep was ending, but humanity's watch over the galaxy was just beginning. Dr. Hyun was invited to visit human research facilities that had been hidden throughout the galaxy during the long years of exile. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he knew about the limits of scientific achievement. Humans had not spent their time in hibernation, but had continued to conduct research using automated systems that had been running continuously for 500,000 years. They had solved problems that had puzzled scientists for millennia and had developed technologies that seemed to violate fundamental laws of physics. The most remarkable discovery was that humanity had learned to manipulate the basic forces that held the universe together. They could create or destroy matter at will and could alter the flow of time within localized regions of space. Their ships were not just vessels, but mobile platforms for engineering projects that could reshape entire star systems to make them more suitable for life. They had become gardeners on a cosmic scale with the power to nurture civilizations or to eliminate threats that posed dangers to intelligent life. Captain Sue was given a tour of Earth's surface and was amazed by what she saw. The planet that had been covered in ruins and abandoned cities when they first arrived was already beginning to bloom with new life. Automated systems that had been dormant for centuries were rebuilding infrastructure and preparing the world for the return of its original inhabitants. Gardens were being planted in places where cities had once stood, and the atmosphere was being cleaned of pollutants that had accumulated during the long abandonment. The humans who were returning to Earth were not the same species that had fled 500,000 years ago. Their long exile had changed them in ways that went beyond simple technological advancement. They had learned patience on a scale that measured time and geological epochs, and they had developed a perspective that encompassed the welfare of entire galaxies, rather than just their own immediate needs. Colonel Taewon showed the Vorthak delegation some of the weapons that had been used against the Devourers, and explained that these systems could be reconfigured to serve peaceful purposes. The matter conversion beams that had erased enemy ships could be used to mine asteroids or to clean up space debris. The dimensional manipulation technology could create stable wormholes that would allow instant travel between star systems. The artificial intelligences that had controlled their war machines could be reprogrammed to serve as teachers and advisors for developing civilizations. As human ships spread throughout the galaxy, they brought with them gifts that would transform the lives of every spacefaring species. Medical technology that could cure diseases and extend lifespans. Energy systems that could provide unlimited power without depleting natural resources. Agricultural techniques that could make barren worlds bloom with life. The species that had returned from exile was offering to share the knowledge they had accumulated during 500,000 years of preparation. The transformation was not limited to technology, but included wisdom that humanity had gained through their long ordeal. They had learned that survival required cooperation rather than competition, and that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. The bitter lessons of their exile had taught them that the greatest victories were won, not through superior firepower, but through superior patience and planning. Admiral Ji-young established a new organization called the Galactic Protection Service that would monitor space for threats to intelligent life and would respond to emergencies with the speed and efficiency that had characterized their victory over the Devourers. Human ships would patrol the void between stars and would intervene whenever they detected dangers that local civilizations could not handle on their own. Captain So-young led the first joint exploration mission that included crews from a dozen different species working together to map unexplored regions of the galaxy. The humans provided the advanced ships and technology, while their alien partners contributed their own unique perspectives and capabilities. The cooperation that emerged from these mixed crews pointed toward a future where species differences would be sources of strength rather than causes for conflict. The city of Seoul was the first Earth metropolis to be fully restored, and it became a symbol of humanity's transformation from refugees to guardians. Alien visitors could walk through streets where human children played alongside young beings from a dozen different worlds. The parks and gardens that had replaced military installations were filled with plants and animals from throughout the galaxy, and the skyline featured architecture that blended human aesthetics with design elements borrowed from their new allies. The Vorthak established an embassy in the restored city, and Admiral Minho became the first alien ambassador to the returned human government. His reports to the Empire described a species that had evolved beyond conquest into something that could only be described as cosmic gardeners. They were using their incredible technology to nurture life throughout the galaxy and were creating conditions that would allow civilizations to flourish for millions of years to come. As the years passed, it became clear that humanity's return marked the beginning of a new age in galactic history. The species that had once been driven from their home by an implacable enemy had returned as protectors of all intelligent life. Their sleeping war fleet had awakened not just to fight, but to ensure that the galaxy would enter a period of peace and prosperity that would last for geological ages. The children who played in the gardens of Earth would grow up in a universe where the ancient terrors had been banished forever, and where every world was protected by guardians who had learned patience from exile and wisdom from suffering. The long sleep was over, and the even longer peace was just beginning. Humanity had come home and the galaxy was finally safe.